The heavy scent of gardenia perfume in Suite 1002 was thick enough to choke the life out of the room, a cloying mask for the desperation vibrating between the walls. Elena stood in the threshold for a heartbeat, her shadows stretching long across the plush cream carpet. The scene was worse than the frantic whispers in the lobby had suggested. Juliana was hunched over the mahogany writing desk, her hand trembling so violently that the fountain pen in her grip scratched a jagged, meaningless ink stain onto the legal document before her. Hovering over her like a bird of prey was her aunt, Margaret, whose manicured fingers were clamped firmly onto Juliana's shoulder, pressing her down. "Just your name, darling," Margaret urged, her voice a terrifying blend of honey and steel. "Think of the family. Think of the legacy. It's just a signature." The click of the door closing behind Elena was the only warning they had. Margaret didn't look up, assuming it was a maid or a submissive assistant. "We are not to be disturbed," she snapped, her eyes never leaving the paper. "Then it's a good thing I've never been very good at following directions," Elena said, her voice cool and level. The tension in the room snapped. Margaret's head whipped around, her face contorting into a mask of indignant fury. Juliana, however, let out a sob that sounded like a physical release of air. The pen clattered to the floor, splashing a drop of midnight blue ink onto the rug. Elena didn't wait for an invitation. She crossed the room with a predator's grace, her heels silent on the carpet, but her presence filling every square inch of the suite. Before Margaret could summon a sharp retort, Elena was there, physically stepping into the narrow space between the chair and the desk. She didn't just intervene. She took command. Elena leaned down, placing a protective hand on the back of Juliana's chair, and slowly straightened her spine until she was looking down at Margaret from a height that felt mountainous. "The girl is hyperventilating, Margaret," Elena said, her eyes narrowing. "And you're treating a legal document like a ransom note. Move back." "This is family business, Elena. You have no standing here," Margaret hissed, though she instinctively took a half-step back from the sheer coldness radiating off the younger woman. "I have the standing of someone who doesn't want to see a fraud charge leveled against this estate by tomorrow morning," Elena replied. She shifted her gaze down to Juliana, who was staring up at her with wide, watery eyes, looking for a lifeline. Elena didn't offer a soft smile. She offered strength. She stood over the girl, a human shield of silk and iron, effectively cutting off Margaret's line of sight to her prey. She could feel the heat of Margaret's rage behind her, but Elena's focus was entirely on the trembling girl in the chair. "Look at me, Juliana," Elena commanded softly. The girl obeyed. "You aren't signing anything today. Not under these lights, and certainly not with a ghost at your throat." Elena reached out and picked up the document, her eyes scanning the dense legalese for only a second before she folded it neatly and tucked it under her arm. The finality of the movement was absolute. The room grew quiet, the only sound the distant hum of the hotel's ventilation and Juliana's hitching breaths finally beginning to steady. Elena remained an immovable pillar, her shadow shielding the niece from the woman who had spent a lifetime trying to eclipse her. "Would you like me to continue with the next scene where Elena confronts Margaret privately, or should we focus on Juliana's recovery?" The rain over the city didn't just fall. It hammered against the glass of the Grand Meridian's revolving doors like it was trying to demand entry. When Elena stepped through them, she didn't look like a woman who had just fought a gale. She moved with a frighteningly calm precision, her trench coat shedding water in rhythmic droplets onto the polished marble floor. She didn't pause to check her reflection in the gilded mirrors of the lobby. She didn't need to. Elena knew exactly how she looked, like a storm that had finally found its target. The lobby was a cathedral of quiet wealth, all hushed tones and the scent of expensive lilies, but Elena walked through it with a stride that cut through the atmosphere of forced civility. She was a ghost in the machinery of the elite, the woman they called when the inheritance was too messy or the scandal too loud to be handled by lawyers alone. At the concierge desk, a young man in a perfectly pressed uniform looked up, his professional smile faltering as he met her gaze. He didn't know her name, few did, but he recognized the energy. It was the presence of a strong hand, a term whispered in the backrooms of the city's oldest estates. Elena was the invisible porter of high society. She didn't carry luggage. She carried the weight of secrets that could crush a family line if dropped. Suite 1002, Elena said. It wasn't a request. The concierge hesitated, his hand hovering over the guest register. I'm sorry, madam. That floor is currently under a private hold for the Sterling party. No visitors are. I'm not a visitor, Arthur, she interrupted, her voice a low, melodic threat. She didn't know his name from a badge. She knew it because she had memorized the staff roster before her car had even crossed the bridge. I am the conclusion. Ring the room and tell Margaret that the shadow she's been running from has finally caught up. Or, better yet, just give me the key and save yourself the lecture on professional boundaries. She leaned forward slightly, the light of the crystal chandeliers catching the sharp, intelligent amber of her eyes. It was a look that had dismantled CEOs and silenced matriarchs. In her history, a strong hand meant more than just firmness. It meant the ability to reach into a chaotic situation and snap the bones of a problem until they set in the right direction. She had spent a decade cleaning up the jagged edges of other people's lives, leaving her own hands cold, but her reputation ironclad. The concierge didn't reach for the phone. He reached for a gold-embossed key card, his movements jerky and hurried. As he slid it across the marble, his fingers brushed hers, and he recoiled slightly from the chill of her skin. Elena took the card without a word of thanks. She turned toward the elevators, her coat swirling around her ankles like a dark tide. She could almost feel the vibration of the drama unfolding 10 floors above, the frantic scratching of a pen, the desperate gasps of a girl who didn't realize she was being sold. The Grand Meridian was built on secrets, but Elena was built to break them. As the elevator doors hissed shut, she watched her own reflection in the brushed steel, her expression as unreadable as a closed grave. The strong hand was here, and by the time she left the building, the Sterling legacy would either be saved or gutted. She hadn't decided which yet. The 11th floor of the Grand Meridian smelled of beeswax and old money, a stark contrast to the rain-slicked iron of the streets below. Elena didn't knock. She used the gold-embossed key card with a clinical efficiency that bordered on the irreverent. The heavy oak doors to the primary suite swung open, revealing a room bathed in the amber glow of a dying fire. At the center of the opulence sat Mrs. Montgomery. She was a woman carved from the very marble of the hotel's foundations, draped in a high-collared charcoal silk that seemed designed to fortify rather than adorn. Her silver hair was pinned back with a precision that defied physics, yet she sat in a wingback chair that seemed to swallow her small frame. This was the woman who had once dictated the social pulse of 3 continents, yet now she sat in a silence, so profound it felt like a physical weight in the room. Elena stepped into the light, her damp trench coat a dark smudge against the cream-colored upholstery. Mrs. Montgomery didn't turn her head. She simply stared into the embers, her profile sharp enough to cut glass. "You're late, Elena," the matriarch said, her voice a fragile rasp that still carried the cadence of command. "Or perhaps I'm just impatient for the end of things." "I took the scenic route through the lobby," Elena replied, moving toward the sideboard to pour a glass of neat bourbon. She didn't ask permission. In this world, permission was for those who didn't already hold the cards. "I ran into Margaret on my way up." She seemed motivated. At the mention of her daughter's name, Mrs. Montgomery's hand flinched, a microscopic movement that would have escaped anyone without Elena's strong hands training. Elena walked closer, setting the glass down on the small table beside the older woman. As she leaned in, the firelight shifted, casting a harsh, flickering glow across Mrs. Montgomery's face. That was when Elena saw it. High on the matriarch's cheekbone, partially obscured by the meticulous application of heavy concealer and the shadow of her silver tresses, was a faint, mottled discoloration. To a casual observer, it might have been an age spot or a trick of the light. To Elena, it was a map. It was the shadow of a bruise, the kind left by a thumb pressed too hard during a hissed argument, a mark of physical coercion that screamed louder than any verbal plea for help. The silence in the room changed then. It was no longer the silence of dignity, it was the silence of a hostage. Elena reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from the woman's face. Mrs. Montgomery didn't flinch away this time, but her eyes, dark and clouded with cataracts, flickered toward Elena's with a sudden, piercing clarity. They were the eyes of a woman who had spent 80 years winning and was now horrified to find herself losing to her own blood. "She's pushing the girl to sign," Elena said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous hum. "But she's pushing you, too, isn't she?" Mrs. Montgomery closed her eyes, the effort of maintaining her composure turning her knuckles white where they gripped the velvet arms of the chair. "Margaret always did have a heavy touch," she whispered. "She thinks the sterling legacy is a carcass to be picked clean before the heart stops beating." Elena straightened her spine, the bourbon forgotten. The bruise was a catalyst, a shifting of the tectonic plates of her mission. She hadn't just come here to manage an inheritance. She had come to witness a coup. "I've spent my life being the hand that fixes things, Mrs. Montgomery," Elena said, her shadow stretching across the floor until it touched the hem of the older woman's silk gown. "Usually that means making people sign. Tonight, it means making sure they never get the chance." The matriarch looked up, a ghost of a smile touching her thin lips, a grim, satisfied thing. "Then you had better move quickly, Elena, before the shadow spreads." The heavy, stagnant air of Suite 1002 was thick with the scent of lilies and the metallic tang of unspoken fear, but Elena was about to change the chemistry of the room. She retreated for a moment, not out of surrender, but to retrieve the small, heavy paper bag she had tucked into the silk lining of her trench coat. It was a calculated intrusion of the mundane into a world of curated artifice. Mrs. Montgomery watched her with a mixture of confusion and a faint, buried spark of curiosity. The matriarch hadn't eaten anything but cold consommé and strained tea for 3 days, Margaret's idea of a gentle diet for a woman she was trying to wither into submission. Elena reached into the bag and pulled out a wax paper-wrapped bundle that smelled sharply of toasted rye, salty pastrami, and spicy brown mustard. It was a sandwich from a deli 3 blocks over, a place where the floors were covered in sawdust, and the countermen shouted over the roar of the grill. It was loud, grease-stained, and entirely unapologetic. "You can't be serious," Mrs. Montgomery whispered, her eyes tracking the steam rising from the paper. "Margaret would have the kitchen staff fired if she saw that in here." "Margaret isn't here," Elena said, her voice a low, steady hum. She pulled a small folding table closer to the wingback chair and unwrapped the sandwich with the same clinical precision she used to dismantle a contract. "And the kitchen staff didn't make this. This was made by a man named Solly who doesn't care about your pedigree, only that you're hungry." Elena broke off a small, manageable piece, ensuring the edges were crisp and the meat succulent. She held it out, not as a servant would, but as a conspirator. There was a profound intimacy in the gesture, a defiance of the shadow of the bruise that still darkened the woman's cheek. Mrs. Montgomery hesitated, her manicured fingers trembling as they reached out. When she took the first bite, the change was instantaneous. The shock of the salt and the heat of the mustard seemed to act like a defibrillator to her senses. Her shoulders, previously hunched under the weight of her daughter's expectations, straightened. A faint wash of color, real color, not the product of a cosmetic brush, bloomed across her pale features. "It tastes like trouble," the older woman murmured, her voice regaining a sliver of its former resonance. "It tastes like autonomy," Elena corrected. She watched the matriarch eat, noting how each bite seemed to fortify the woman's spirit. Strength was a physical requirement for the war they were about to wage, and Elena knew that you couldn't fight a revolution on an empty stomach. She leaned back, watching the firelight dance in the bourbon glass she had poured earlier. This strong hand wasn't just about force. Sometimes it was about the gentle, steady pressure of a hand holding a piece of bread, reminding a prisoner that they were still alive. By the time the wax paper was empty, the woman in the chair was no longer a victim waiting for the end. She was a sterling, and she was beginning to remember why that used to matter. Elena gathered the crumbs, leaving no trace of their rebellion behind, save for the lingering scent of rye and the newfound steel in Mrs. Montgomery's gaze. Now, Elena said, her amber eyes locking onto the matriarch's. Let's talk about how we're going to break Margaret's heart. The heavy, oak-paneled quiet of the suite was shattered not by a bang, but by the melodic, rehearsed trill of a laugh that didn't reach the air before it felt filtered. The door swept open, and Claire Sterling drifted in, a vision of cream cashmere and effortless grace that seemed to mock the damp, gray reality of the world outside the Grand Meridian's windows. She moved toward Mrs. Montgomery with her arms outstretched, a movement so fluid it looked choreographed by a master of the stage. "Grandmother, darling," Claire cooed, her voice a soft carillon of concern. She knelt at the older woman's feet, taking the matriarch's frail hands in her own and rubbing them with a feigned warmth that made the hair on the back of Elena's neck stand up. Elena watched from the shadows near the heavy velvet drapes, her amber eyes tracking every micro-expression. On the surface, it was a tableau of generational devotion. To anyone else, Claire looked like the dutiful granddaughter, the one soft heart in a family of sharks. But Elena had spent her life dissecting the anatomy of a lie, and she saw the warmth for exactly what it was, a performance. Claire's eyes remained sharp and predatory even as her lips curved into a sympathetic pout. She wasn't checking her grandmother's pulse out of love. She was measuring the remaining strength in the woman's grip. It was a choreographed cruelty, a way to occupy the victim's space so entirely that they felt they had no room left to breathe, let alone resist. "You look so tired, Nana," Claire whispered, her thumb stroking the very edge of the bruise Elena had discovered earlier. It was a subtle, agonizing pressure, a reminder of who held the power now. "Mother says you've been difficult about the medication again. We only want you to find some peace." Elena stepped forward, the floorboards offering no protest under her boots. "Peace usually doesn't require a notary and a witness, Claire." Claire didn't flinch. She turned her head slowly, a practiced smile blooming on her face like a Venus flytrap. "Elena, I didn't realize the help was still hovering. Shouldn't you be downstairs checking the manifests? Or perhaps finding a raincoat that hasn't seen quite so much weather?" The insult was delivered with a sweetness that would have curdled milk. Elena didn't take the bait. She walked to the other side of the wingback chair, mirroring Claire's position but standing tall, a dark sentinel against the girl's artificial light. She saw the way Claire's gaze flickered to the empty glass of bourbon and the faint, lingering scent of rye bread. The mask slipped for a fraction of a second, a flash of pure, cold irritation that someone had dared to interfere with the slow starvation of the matriarch's will. "I find that the help sees the things the family chooses to ignore," Elena said, her voice dropping to that dangerous, low hum. She looked down at Claire's hands, still clamped over Mrs. Montgomery's. "Like the fact that your grandmother has more color in her cheeks than she's had in a week. Or the fact that she's currently trying to pull her hand away from yours." Claire's grip tightened instinctively before she caught herself and smoothed the silk of her grandmother's gown instead. The air in the room grew brittle. The performance was failing, and the predator beneath the cashmere was beginning to show its teeth. Elena realized then that Claire wasn't just Margaret's pawn, she was the architect. The daughter provided the blunt force, but the granddaughter provided the psychological cage. "Family business is a delicate thing, Elena," Claire said, rising to her full height, her eyes now level and devoid of their manufactured sparkle. "Don't overstep. A strong hand can easily be broken if it gets caught in doors that aren't meant for it." "I've spent my life in those doors, Claire," Elena replied, her shadow falling over the younger woman. "And I've never been the one who ended up crushed." The silence in the suite had curdled into something suffocating. When Elena returned an hour later, the fire had collapsed into gray ash, and the room felt unnervingly cold. Margaret and Claire were gone, likely downstairs to refine their legal ambush, but they had left behind a psychological cruelty that was far more effective than any locked door. Mrs. Montgomery's wingback chair had been rotated. She was no longer facing the hearth or the expansive windows that overlooked the rain-blurred skyline of the city. Instead, she had been positioned inches away from a blank, shadowed corner of the room. She was staring directly into the intersection of two cream-colored walls, her world reduced to a 90-degree angle of nothingness. Elena stopped in the center of the room, her jaw tightening. It was a sensory deprivation tactic used to break the spirit, a way to remind the matriarch that she was no longer a participant in her own life, merely an object to be stored. Mrs. Montgomery sat perfectly still, her hands resting limply in her lap, her gaze fixed on the wallpaper as if she were trying to burn a hole through it with the sheer force of her remaining will. "How long have you been looking at the plaster?" Elena asked, her voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. The older woman didn't turn. "Long enough to count the patterns in the weave," she whispered, her voice paper-thin. "Claire said the light from the window was too straining for my eyes. She said I needed focus." Elena didn't waste breath on an argument. She stepped behind the heavy chair, her strong hands gripping the velvet frame. With a single, fluid motion, she pivoted the massive piece of furniture. The casters groaned against the hardwood before finding the plush rug, and in an instant, the world rushed back in. The floor-to-ceiling windows were suddenly there, a vast expanse of slate-gray sky and the shimmering amber lights of the city below. The rain was still streaking the glass, creating a rhythmic, living tapestry that moved and breathed. Elena pushed the chair all the way to the glass until the matriarch was practically hovering over the edge of the world. "The light isn't a strain," Elena said, leaning over the back of the chair so her shadow wouldn't obstruct the view. "It's a reminder that there is a world outside this suite that doesn't belong to Margaret." Mrs. Montgomery's breath hitched. Her eyes, which had been dull and fixed, began to track the movement of the traffic far below. She reached out a trembling hand, pressing her fingertips against the cool glass. The contact seemed to ground her, pulling her back from the white void she had been forced to inhabit for hours. "I thought I had forgotten the color of the sky," the matriarch murmured. She looked up at Elena, and for the first time, the shadow of the bruise on her cheek seemed less like a mark of defeat and more like a battle scar. "They want me to believe I am already a ghost, Elena. They want me to fade until the signature is the only thing left of me." "You aren't a ghost until I say so," Elena replied, her gaze as steady as the horizon. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, silver-cased compass, a relic from her own past, a tool for those who refuse to stay lost. She placed it in Mrs. Montgomery's palm. "Keep your eyes on the horizon. I'm going to find the notary Margaret has hidden in the building, and when I come back, we aren't just going to change your view. We're going to change the map." Elena stood straight, watching as the older woman's grip tightened around the compass. The wall of silence had been breached, and as Elena turned to leave the room, she knew this strong hand was no longer just a reputation. It was a promise of a coming storm. The gold-leafed elevator door slid open with a hushed chime, depositing Elena back into the lobby's oppressive opulence. The air here was filtered and cooled to an exacting degree, designed to make the wealthy feel as though the outside world, with its humidity and its consequences, did not exist. Elena's heels clicked sharply against the marble as she bypassed the concierge and headed straight for the mahogany-paneled door marked private. She didn't wait for an invitation. Inside, the hotel manager, a man named Mr. Sterling Vane, whose very name suggested a desperate climb toward the family he served, looked up from a crystal decanter. He was a man of soft edges and expensive tailoring, his face a map of carefully cultivated neutrality. "The Montgomery suite," Elena began, her voice a low, vibrating chord of controlled fury. "There is a woman in suite 1102 with a bruise on her face that didn't come from a fall. There is a forced signing being orchestrated by Margaret and Claire Sterling. I suggest you call the house physician and a witness who isn't wearing a Sterling signet ring." Mr. Vane didn't leap for the telephone. He didn't even drop his gaze. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate sip of his drink, the ice clinking against the glass with a sound like a shutter closing. "The Grand Meridian prizes discretion above all things, Elena," he said, his voice as smooth as the bourbon she had seen upstairs. "What happens within the walls of a private suite is the business of the guests, provided the bill is settled. And the Sterling bill is substantial." Elena leaned over his desk, her strong hands flat against the leather blotter. The distance between them vanished, replaced by the suffocating heat of her proximity. Discretion is for affairs and overdrawn accounts, Vane. This is elder abuse. This is a crime unfolding in real time under your roof. Vane sighed, a sound of weary condescension. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a ledger, not the digital guest list, but a handwritten record of contributions to the hotel's renovation fund. He slid it toward her, his finger resting on a line that showed a donation large enough to buy a fleet of the Lexus cars Elena had seen in the driveway. It was signed with Margaret Sterling's aggressive, looping script. The management is not merely aware of the Sterling family's needs, Vane whispered, his eyes finally showing a flicker of cold steel. The management is supported by them. Every light in this lobby, every silk sheet in that suite, is paid for by the grace of that legacy. If Mrs. Montgomery is fatigued, as her daughter claims, we are here to ensure she is not disturbed by outside interference. The realization hit Elena with the cold weight of a winter wave. This wasn't just a family dispute, it was a fortress. The Grand Meridian wasn't a hotel, it was a gilded cage where the guards were on the payroll of the kidnappers. This strong hand she had brought to the task was suddenly grappling with a monster that had no throat to choke. Vane stood up, adjusting his cuffs with a finality that signaled the end of the conversation. I suggest you take a car back to the airport, Elena. Your services are no longer required, and frankly, your presence has become a bit of a stain on the carpet. Elena didn't blink. She stood straight, her coat swirling around her like a dark omen. She saw the way Vane's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his glass again. He was afraid, but he was bought, and in this city, the latter always outweighed the former. You think the peril protects you, Elena said, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a physical threat. But a peril is just a paper trail. And I've always been very good at following the ink until I find the person holding the pen. She turned and walked out, the heavy door thudding shut behind her. She didn't head for the exit. If the management was bought, then the rules of the building no longer applied. She would have to stop being the porter and start being the locksmith. The air in the 11th floor corridor had turned frigid, a pressurized vacuum that seemed to suck the oxygen from Elena's lungs as she approached the double doors of Suite 1102. She didn't need a key card this time. The doors were ajar, the heavy wood vibrating with the sharp, jagged edge of Margaret's voice. Sign it, Mother. The ink is drying, and my patience has already evaporated. Elena stepped into the room, her silhouette cutting through the artificial warmth of the foyer. The scene was a grotesque mirror of the one she had dismantled hours before. Juliana was gone, likely locked in a secondary bedroom, leaving only the matriarch and her shadow. Margaret was no longer pretending. She stood over Mrs. Montgomery's chair, her hand clamped so tightly on the old woman's shoulder that the silk of the gown was beginning to tear. In her other hand, she held a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen, like a weapon. I told you, Elena said, her voice a low, tectonic rumble that stopped Margaret's hand in midair. The signing is over. Margaret turned, her face a distorted mask of aristocratic fury. You were escorted out, you common little vulture. Vane told me you were gone. Vane is a man who mistakes a price tag for a pulse, Elena replied, walking toward them. Her stride was rhythmic, a predator's pacing. I don't leave until the debt is settled. And right now, you owe your mother a great deal of skin. Margaret's eyes flashed with a manic, cornered light. She didn't summon the security she had bought. She didn't call for Claire. Instead, the years of repressed resentment and the frantic pressure of a crumbling empire snapped. She lunged forward, her hand swinging in a wide, desperate arc aimed at Elena's face. It was a clumsy move, born of privilege rather than practice, and to Elena, it moved in slow motion. These strong hands didn't just fix contracts, they were built for the physics of impact. Elena didn't flinch. She stepped into the strike, her left hand rising with a blurred, liquid grace to catch Margaret's wrist in a grip that felt like a steel vice. The impact of bone against bone echoed in the quiet suite, a sharp, final crack that silenced the room. Margaret let out a strangled gasp, her knees buckling as Elena applied a precise, agonizing pressure to the nerve cluster in her forearm. The gold fountain pen clattered to the floor, rolling uselessly toward the ash-filled hearth. "You touch her again," Elena whispered, leaning in until their foreheads almost touched, "and I will dismantle your life with the same clinical indifference you used on hers. I don't need a notary to prove what you've done. I just need to keep squeezing." With a sharp, rhythmic shove, Elena sent Margaret stumbling back against the mahogany desk. The woman collapsed into the chair, clutching her reddening wrist, her breath coming in ragged, ugly hitches. The veneer of the sterling name had finally shattered, leaving only a frightened, middle-aged woman shivering in the wreckage of her own cruelty. Elena didn't look back at her. She turned to Mrs. Montgomery, whose hand was still clutching the silver compass Elena had given her. The matriarch's eyes weren't filled with horror. They were filled with a grim, crystalline satisfaction. For the first time in decades, the shadow had been pushed back by a hand stronger than the one that cast it. Elena reached down and picked up the fallen pen, capping it with a definitive click. The physical confrontation was over, but the war for the Grand Meridian had only just begun. She could hear the heavy thud of security boots in the hallway, alerted finally by the silent alarms Margaret must have tripped. "Keep the compass," Elena said, her voice steady and cool as she straightened her trench coat. "I think the wind is finally shifting in our favor." The basement of the Grand Meridian was a world of humming servers and flickering monitors, a stark contrast to the velvet-lined silence of the floors above. Elena didn't belong here, but the strong hand knew that every fortress had a cellar and every secret had a digital heartbeat. She sat in a cramped security booth, the air smelling of ozone and stale coffee, leaning over the shoulder of a young night shift technician whose loyalty to the sterling payroll had been eclipsed by the raw, undeniable evidence on the screen. "Go back to November," Elena commanded, her voice a low vibration in the small room. The technician's fingers danced over the console, and the grainy, black-and-white feed of Suite 1102 flickered into life. This wasn't the curated theater Claire and Margaret presented to the world. This was the raw, unedited footage of a 4-month siege. Elena watched in a cold, shimmering silence as the timeline of rebuilding revealed itself to be a meticulous process of destruction. In November, Mrs. Montgomery was still walking to the window on her own, her movements regal and fluid. By December, the footage showed Margaret standing over her for hours, the daughter's shadow elongated by the flickering hearth as she snatched books from the matriarch's hands. Elena saw the moment the first dietary restriction was implemented, the way Claire would smile while removing a plate of actual food, replacing it with a gray, unidentifiable broth. It was a slow-motion execution of a personality. The cameras, positioned for guest safety, had instead captured the systematic stripping of a woman's autonomy. Elena watched as the chairs were moved, 1 inch at a time, until the matriarch was finally oriented toward that blank, cream-colored corner. It wasn't a sudden coup, it was seasonal erosion. "Here," the technician whispered, pausing the frame on a Tuesday in late February. On the screen, Claire was leaning into her grandmother's personal space. The girl's face was a mask of angelic concern, but her fingers were clamped around Mrs. Montgomery's wrist with a terrifying, white-knuckled intensity. The matriarch's head was bowed, her spirit visibly buckling under the weight of the warmth that was actually a cage. "They told us it was physical therapy," the boy said, his voice trembling. "They said she was losing her mind and needed to be reoriented. We were told to delete the backups every 30 days. "And yet you didn't," Elena noted, her amber eyes reflecting the cold light of the monitors. "I've lived in this city my whole life," he replied, finally looking at her. "I know the difference between a doctor and a predator." Elena reached out and tapped the glass of the monitor where Margaret was seen hiding a stack of legal documents under a sofa cushion. This was the paper trail Vane claimed didn't exist. It was 4 months of choreographed cruelty, a digital ledger of every bruise, every missed meal, and every hour of forced silence. The sterling legacy wasn't being preserved. It was being harvested while the root was still alive. Elena stood up, the weight of the evidence settling into her bones like lead. She didn't need a notary anymore, and she certainly didn't need Mr. Vane's permission. She had the night shift footage, the ghost in the machine that Margaret and Claire had forgotten to exorcise. Copy it all, Elena said, her voice dropping to that dangerous, final hum. Every frame, every hour, every flicker of her trying to fight back. We're going to show the board what a sterling renovation actually looks like. She turned toward the heavy steel door, her trench coat snapping behind her. The strong hand had found its lever, and as she stepped back into the elevator, Elena knew that the Grand Meridian's walls were about to come crashing down on the people who thought they owned the foundation. The aftermath of the footage was not a loud explosion, but a cold, surgical extraction. By dawn, the Grand Meridian's lobby was filled with men in dark suits who didn't carry luggage and didn't answer to Mr. Vane. The Sterling Board of Directors had seen the digital ledger of Claire's choreographed cruelty, and the warmth of the granddaughter's performance had finally frozen over. Claire was led through the lobby not as a princess of the empire, but as a liability being purged. She wore her cream cashmere like a shroud, her face pale and drawn, her eyes darting toward the elevators as if she expected a reprieve that was never coming. There were no cameras, no public scandals, just the quiet, absolute erasure of her name from the hotel's registry and the family's future. Elena watched from the mezzanine, her hands resting on the gold railing, her amber eyes tracking the girl until the revolving doors took her back into the gray city rain. This strong hand had done more than break a grip. It had severed a bloodline. Upstairs, Suite 1102 had been transformed. The scent of gardenia and medicinal tea had been replaced by the crisp, sharp air of an open window and the lingering aroma of real coffee. Mrs. Montgomery sat in her wingback chair, but it was no longer positioned toward the wall. She was facing the horizon, the silver compass Elena had given her resting on the side table like a talisman. The door chimes echoed softly, and Elena stepped inside. She no longer wore the damp trench coat of a weary traveler. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer, the fabric as sharp and unforgiving as her gaze. She wasn't a visitor anymore, and she wasn't a guest. The locks have been changed, Elena said, her voice a steady, low hum that filled the rejuvenated room. The security staff on this floor has been replaced by a team that answers to a private server. Mr. Vane has been retired to a quiet estate in the country where he can count his shadows in peace. Mrs. Montgomery turned her head, her silver hair catching the morning light. The shadow of the bruise was fading, replaced by a clarity in her eyes that hadn't been seen in years. She looked at Elena not as a servant, but as the only person in the world who had seen her as a human being when she was being treated as a carcass. "And Margaret?" the matriarch asked, her voice regaining the resonance of a woman who still held the gavel. "Under house arrest at the Connecticut estate," Elena replied. "She'll have all the rest and focus she tried to force on you. But she won't have a pen, and she certainly won't have an audience." Mrs. Montgomery nodded slowly, a grim satisfaction settling into the lines of her face. She reached out and picked up a new contract that lay on the mahogany desk, a simple, one-page document that had nothing to do with inheritances or trust funds. It was a formal appointment of a new resident within the Sterling inner circle. The board wanted to hire a firm, Mrs. Montgomery murmured, her fingers tracing the text. "They wanted a phalanx of men in sunglasses to stand outside my door. I told them I didn't need a phalanx. I needed a hand that knew when to squeeze and when to hold." She signed the paper with a flourish that was bold and unapologetic, the ink dark and permanent. She slid the document across the desk toward Elena. "You are now head of personal security for the Matriarch," Mrs. Montgomery stated, her eyes locking onto Elena's. "You answer to no one but me. Not the board, not the hotel, and certainly not the remains of my family. You are the wall between me and the world, Elena." Elena took the paper, her fingers brushing the cool surface. The invisible porter had become the gatekeeper. She had spent a decade cleaning up the messes of the elite, but now she was the one who decided what stayed and what was thrown away. "I've never been very good at taking orders from anyone else anyway," Elena said, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. She walked to the window, looking out over the city she now partially guarded. The storm had passed, but the air was still charged with the energy of the change she had wrought. Behind her, The matriarch took a sip of her coffee, the steam rising like a peaceful incense. The siege was over, and the strong hand was finally home. The transition of power was quiet, but in the world of the Sterling family, silence was often the loudest warning. Elena moved through the suite with the practiced ease of its new guardian, her presence a low-frequency hum that kept the hotel staff at a respectful distance. Mrs. Montgomery was resting, her breathing deep and, even for the first time in months, leaving Elena alone with the mahogany desk that had served as Margaret's battlefield. Elena didn't believe in coincidences, and she certainly didn't believe Margaret Sterling would leave a room without a contingency. Her strong hands moved over the desk, not looking for papers. Those had been seized by the board, but feeling for the physics of the furniture itself. She traced the underside of the central drawer, her fingertips catching on a microscopic seam in the wood that didn't align with the grain. With a sharp, rhythmic click, a false bottom released. Inside was not a ledger or a deed, but a single, vintage lacquer box, small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. When Elena opened it, the scent of stale tobacco and scorched paper wafted out. There was no gold, only a series of dated Polaroids and a handwritten note in Margaret's jagged, frantic script. The photos didn't show the grandmother. They showed a much younger Margaret, decades ago, standing in front of a different wingback chair. Beside her stood a man whose face had been systematically scratched out with the nib of a fountain pen. In every photo, the man's hand was clamped around Margaret's shoulder in the exact same position she had used on Juliana, the same white-knuckled grip, the same choreographed cruelty. Elena felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. The note beneath the photos was a single sentence, written over and over until the ink bled through the paper. It has to stay in the blood. The secret wasn't a hidden fortune or a final betrayal. It was the revelation that Margaret hadn't invented this torture. She had inherited it. The shadow of the bruise wasn't a new mark on the Sterling legacy. It was the legacy itself. Margaret hadn't been trying to destroy her mother out of simple greed. She had been performing a ritual she believed was the only way to survive the family name. She was a victim who had successfully graduated into a predator, convinced that the only way to hold power was to crush the hand that gave it to her. Elena looked toward the bedroom where the matriarch slept. The cycle was a closed loop, a snake eating its own tail. Margaret's final secret was a warning. The strong hand wasn't just needed to protect the victim, but to break the chain before it reached the next generation. Elena walked to the hearth and struck a single match. She watched as the lacquer box caught fire, the images of the faceless man curling into black ash. She wouldn't tell Mrs. Montgomery. Some ghosts were better left in the fire. As the last flame flickered out, Elena stepped onto the balcony. The city lights reflected in her steady, amber gaze. She wasn't just a guard anymore. She was the circuit breaker. The Sterling name would continue, but the choreographed cruelty ended tonight, under the watch of a hand that finally knew the difference between holding on and letting go.